Welcome to the ClickFarm Interactive Modx tutorial for managing templates and chunks. This is a little bit deeper dive for advanced content editors or developers to understand the basic principles of Modx and managing templates or the display of content associated to the web pages. So previously we've gone over accessing Modx and getting access to the manager and the content associated to that. And one of those examples, we had the home page, which had the additional template variable for the left rail. So we're going to quickly just cover how that is made possible through Modx using templates and the additional properties associated to the content management system. So by clicking on the Elements tab, we get a list of some additional components or services associated to Modx. Templates quickly are the major components or HTML structure that's used to generate the front-end view of the web page. Template variables are module components or widgets that allow us to create dynamic content. So in that case, for the home page, we had this all content, which is actually driven by this template variable called callout. Additionally, we have chunks. Chunks are static HTML or other comprised text that we can reference throughout content or template variables. It's very flexible, so we can render a chunk just about from anywhere. A snippet is a PHP generated code, so this allows us to write PHP scripts that will interface with the Modx API and pull out content that we need to render or modify it as needed. So again, great flexibility with this as you're generating PHP code. So make sure that all proper best practices as far as security restrictions of PHP are used when generating snippets. Plugins allows us to generate components or services that are only rendered during specific actions. So TinyMC is installed on this side, but gives us this nice rich editor. So that's created as a plugin because we only want to render this when the actual page is rendered to the user. So we're basically limiting the control and access to that on when something happens. Categories is just a quick list of, we can categorize any of these items under each of those categories. This would allow us to view those as we generate them. So back to the templates. On the home page we are using the template called Basic, so we'll go ahead and load this up to view it. We can see the template name is Basic. Again, so our template code is pretty much static HTML content. And we're just referencing additional Modx components in here to generate the content for us. So one of the main things we're seeing are these funny looking characters throughout the site. So depending on the structure, this determines what type of service or element is rendered in that area. So a double plus sign uses what's called a system setting variable. So the site URL is actually something that's set up when we install your site, and it'll pull that in. An asterisk is referenced as a template variable. There are some standard template variables that are just packaged in with Modx by default. Page title, content, publish date, those types of things are all pre-built and there to be accessed as needed and do not show up under the template variable listing. So after you have your basic structure, you can go ahead and start dropping in these Modx specific tags as needed where you want them to go. So one other thing that we have for those snippets. So snippets are where we can add additional advanced features and services to the rendering of templates. One common one that we use is called a Wayfinder, which allows us to generate the front-end view of your document tree or all the resources on your site. So we can quickly target those and render those to the front end as needed. In order to access that, we'd simply put in the double bracket, type in that snippet name, Wayfinder. The question mark is telling the snippet that we're going to pass it some additional properties. So one of those properties is start ID. We can tell it to start at 0, which means that we want to pull all pages that start underneath web in this case. So 0 saying just pull everything without a parent, and then start building the structure from there. If we had additional pages that we wanted to start with, let's say we had a section under here that we wanted to start and only render that for like businesses, then we could actually target that ID of that resource here, and it would only list resources underneath that ID. So back to our original request was to add callouts. So quickly what I did was modified the template, created a template variable that was called callouts. As we can see, the template variable name here, callout, matches the actual name that we're referencing here with the asterisk in front of it inside the brackets, which will actually render this template variable and the content associated to that on the page. So again, if we look at home, that template variable is the left rel content sample, which is rendered left rel content sample, and that matches the position that we had set up in our template as far as physical location inside the HTML structure. If we take a quick look at our callout template, we can create any additional template variables by right mouse clicking on new template variable, and that'll bring us to this main editor screen. The name again is the main name that we'll use in referencing that snippet, or sorry, template variable to render inside the page template. Categories allows us to categorize all these template variables so we can quickly find them. This also is what drives the label on the editor page that we saw as well. The caption can be used to quickly identify and tell content editors what the specific template variable is going to do, and you can also add a more lengthy description of it as well. Outside of the name categories, you probably will not want or need to edit any additional features on this page. And the next one we'll probably look at, if we look at properties, we can actually predefine elements or static, if you will, properties to a template variable. So let's say we had one that was called title, and each title that we had, we wanted to add a greater than mark to. We could actually create a property for that and add a greater than mark in here, and then reference that in our output, and that would allow us to also pass in dynamically and modify that greater than on any given page if we wanted to, or template to change it from greater than to, let's say, a colon. We could actually do that dynamically through the templates by passing properties. The input options is the second most critical element when creating the template variable outside of the name itself. The input option is what tells Modx what type of content we want to add as part of this template variable. So in our case, we were using text, so we went ahead and selected rich text, which allows us to use that rich text editor, WYSIWYG editor, if you will, to modify content. We could just as easily change this to image, and then that would change it to an image uploader, where we could actually select an image to upload to the system for that specific space as well. Advanced options here would be we can actually define various options. If we were to use a select list, we can do option 1 and then use the double pipe as noted in the comments to create a drop-down list. So if we saved this, when we went back to the editor, we would see a drop-down list of option 1, option 2. We can go ahead and do that real quick. I click save. And remember, we just changed the list box, single select, so we can only select one of these options. We use the pipe, double pipe to delineate the different options. If I go back to resources home, again, that's a template variable that we have, and we have our new content, and we have our list of options that we can select from. And notice this little funny one down here that's kind of short. That's because we have a blank option in there. So I just wanted to note that if you don't put anything in there, it'll still render that as a space because it's not the last item in there, even though there's no text associated to it. It allows us to only pick one at a time. So again, if we did this and saved it, we would not get that additional space at the end of that drop-down list. So now we just have the two that we have defined. So again, quickly we can identify what type of input we want to use when creating those items for access to content editors by using the input options and selecting the appropriate one. Output options you typically don't need to modify and just leave that as default. The system will know how to best handle that. Template access is critical as this allows us to define what page templates or content pages will have access to this template variable. So if we had callouts that were only accessible via templates from the basic page and not any of these other templates, we would only want to checkbox the basic template and leave all these others empty so that it wouldn't even render there. As content editors entering content, we don't want to add additional clutter to the interface when they're managing content. So this gives them really the pertinent information or content areas that they need to manage relevant content for that page based on their template selection. Access permissions, again in our tutorial we're only covering a single level of access, so if we did have more we would see a list of options here and we could simply check mark the list of groups that we wanted to provide access to that template variable. Media sources by default is always going to be web file system, and you will not need to modify that unless otherwise noted. So a quick recap: we had the general information, which we needed the name. Most crucial part. The second most crucial part was the input type that we want to select. And then third would be our template access to make sure that the template that we want the content associated to have access to. And we click save. And that concludes this tutorial, and we hope you enjoyed it.